Okay, we are gonna do some watercoloring together. So hi guys, it's good to, I miss you all already. So I'm gonna grab a few of my brushes. You should have a good set of brushes. I have like a whole pile. Probably a big flat and a small flat and a couple of rounds. There's 4 brushes in your set. That should do me right there. I should be fine with those. So this is gonna be your first time painting. And I know you've used watercolors before in elementary school and doing other things, but we're going to get a little more technical here. Not super technical, because there's a lot to watercolors. There's watercolors these are cake watercolors. They're called semi-soft because once you get them wet, they kind of soften up a little bit. There's tube watercolors that you can squeeze out. And in fact, we have some in the classroom that if there's a color we just can't quite achieve, you can get some of the tube watercolors. So these, we're gonna kind of stay a little bit more basic for our first time doing watercolor, but in high school, they have just watercolor classes where you can take this even further if this is something you really love. Now to start and just get our first experience with this, we're just going to play a little bit with our brushes and kind of learn a little bit about these. I have this brush here for a reason. This brush here was stored in a way that what has happened to it? It has curved a little bit because whoever stored this either put it in their bag and had it smushed in their bag like this while it was wet, or put it in their cubby bristles first and had it stuck into the back of the cubby so that it was pushing against it and was bent. It's really hard once they have a memory when they're wet and dry to get them to go back, and it will ruin brushes really quickly. So I have a request. When you get your brushes, you'll keep your rubber band, always rubber band from the bottom of the handles and throw it around a few times just to keep them together. Also store them handle first so the bristles are sticking out and can dry overnight. Don't put them in your bag, just put them in your cubby like this. So a little brush etiquette first. Now these brushes need to be checked back in, looking really good. Some of the brushes are a little old, and I know some of them, like maybe this is called the ferrule, maybe it slides off or something. Just show the teacher that it wasn't because you were misusing it. It's just age that might have done that. But a lot of these brushes are brand new, so we want to take really good care of them. I'm going to try to make this brush work because it's the only one. Oh, I do have a different one in here. Here's one that's still straight. You can see this one's green because sometimes these synthetic white hairs stain after a while, and it's okay if your hair's stained. It's not going to hurt anything. So we're going to use one that's a little bit straighter for our painting. Now the thing about watercolor brushes are made in a way that they're made to hold a lot of water. Acrylic brushes, if you were painting with acrylic, are much stiffer and aren't meant to hold water. So that's what makes these different. They're a little more fragile. Really nice watercolor brushes can cost $100 a piece if you're wanting super nice watercolor brushes. These are still pretty expensive, so we need to take really, really good care of them. So we're just going to play around on, you're going to use a page in your sketchbook, one of the heavier weight pages. I know my page is a little big, but I'll try to take up the same amount of space that you guys would take up. Okay, so we're just going to play a little bit. Let's just get our brush a little bit wet. We always rub our brush on the edge if we have too much water, or we dab our brush in a paper towel to remove some water. So that is the way that we can remove water. We never tap our brush, because it flings water and paint over onto our neighbors across the way or next to us and splatters water everywhere. So no tapping, just wiping or wiping. Okay, got that? Okay, we're gonna go ahead and put a little bit of water in here. Now you might have in elementary school just like filled these wells full of water. That's not how we want to use our watercolors, or these will get too moist and too saturated and soft, and they will get gloppy and weird. So I'm just going to use red here to begin with. I'm just going to kind of start to get a little red. I can see it starting to happen. And the key thing about watercolor, one of the first things you need to learn is water proportion to pigment proportion and how it changes things. I'm going to put quite a bit of pigment in here with water, so it's looking pretty red here on the end, and I'm just going to paint a line. Well, that looks pretty red. Now, watercolor inherently is translucent. You should be able to see things underneath. That's still pretty red, but when it dries, if I had a drawing under here, I would still be able to see a dark line under there. All right, so that's with a lot of pigment and very little water. Now, if I just barely dip this in the water and I remove a little bit, now I have less pigment and I have more water. Let's draw another line. Oh, that changes the value of this completely. This is a much airier, lighter. Let's do it again. Just barely dip, wipe a little off. Let's see if we get a different, oh yes, it's getting lighter. Let's keep doing that and changing the value of our line. Now, if you need to pause the video to catch up, I'm kind of working a little quickly so the video isn't super long, and now you can barely see it. So we changed that value. Now I can even come in here and like pick up some of this and move some of it down. Watercolor is really cool how you can change it and pull things out. Now, in fact, I want to show that to you. There's something called a thirsty brush. If I get this all the way wet and clean and I dry my brush, this is a really important thing too. Maybe I'm going to just get this a little wetter so I can kind of demonstrate it a little bit. Okay, get this wet, super dry, super dry. This is going to want to suck up water really well. So I could come in and I could take this and see how I can lighten the color. Maybe you got it too dark to begin with. And you can, it's kind of like a little sponge soaking it back up as long as it's still wet. Sometimes with some colors you can re-wet it and still pull it away. Some colors are really permanent and won't do that. So thirsty brush is a really good technique as well. Okay, so we've done a few kind of cool things here. Now we want to play a little bit with some color mixing because that's going to be important for this project. So the next activity I want us to do is we're going to grab our pencil for a second, and we might switch to our flat brush next just to kind of feel what that's like. But we're going to draw two triangles. One's upside down, one's upside up. So we're going to draw a triangle here, and I'm going to draw a triangle here, right over the top. Okay, so I've got 6 points going on. That's what we want to do. 3 of these one is going to be red. You don't have to write the colors down. One will be yellow, and one is going to be blue. You guys know red, yellow, and blue are our primary colors. So let's just kind of play with our flat brush. Let's see what it's kind of like. Same thing, wipe a little off. Let's get a little yellow. And let's paint this patch yellow right by this point. I know I have a word there. Now I'm showing you how it's so translucent. You can see your drawing right underneath. I'm gonna wash my brush, I'm gonna dry my brush, just wet it a little bit. I'm gonna get a little blue. Okay, great. And a little red. Now, I just used red, yellow, and blue, and I like that we've gotten those just a little bit wet because now it's going to make the rest of this easier. For the rest of this, we're only going to use red, yellow, blue. You can't use your orange, you can't use your purple, you can't use your green. We're only going to use red, yellow, blue. And we're going to start to experiment with tinting strength. It's something that I want to talk to you about. Of these 3 colors, one of them is very weak, and I think you could probably guess, but it is yellow. It takes a lot of yellow to tint something. It's a weak tinting strength. Well, red is pretty strong and blue is really strong. So when you're mixing colors, if I were to try to make orange, I'm going to need a lot of yellow and just not a ton of red. I'm going to work the yellow first and get a good amount of yellow and drop red into it. With blue being stronger, I'm going to put down some red first this time, the weaker color first, and slowly put blue into it until I get it the value I want. And the same thing here, blue and yellow. Whoa, I'm going to have to be really careful and use the tiniest amount of blue to make my green. So let's start to experiment with that a little bit. As we do this, we're also being really careful not to let our colors mix in the wells up here. We're letting the colors layer and mix right here because they're see-through. It's not like you're stirring paint together, but you are layering paint to make new colors. So let's make a good layer of yellow. We're going to want a lot of pigment to water ratio. Okay, let's even get a little more in there. And I'm going to make a really hardy patch of yellow right here. Okay, that looks really good. Okay, while I'm at it and my brush has got this yellow on it, I'm going to go ahead and do a patch of yellow here too. Okay, so I've got 2 spots that are going to need yellow. Now remember, I don't need a ton of red, so we're just going to kind of not get too much red, maybe like kind of that amount. Okay, we can even test it a little bit if we want to. That looks a little strong. Maybe I'll get just a little less. That might be a little weak. You kind of have to work back and forth a little bit. That feels pretty good right there. And I'm going to put a little bit of that red into here, and oh, yep. There it is. I've got my orange happening by layering that on. Okay, got a layer of orange. Let's try it here with the blue. Now remember, blue has a lot of tinting strength, so we don't need a ton of blue. Let's even test it. That's pretty watery blue. I think we're going to be okay there. And I work that blue in. Maybe I need even just a little more blue. And I've created a green. Really nice. Okay, let's go ahead and let's do our purple. We're going to need some red first, our weaker color first. Okay, we've got some red. Now blue's really strong, but with red it's a little bit stronger. We don't have to be quite as careful as we did with the yellow. I'm going to go ahead and put in a bit of blue. Now that might have been too much blue. I'm going to get my brush thirsty and I'm going to pull just a little bit of that out. And I've got my purple happening there. So I want you just to kind of play with tinting strength. That's why we're doing this little color wheel for a minute in here. And we look really good. Now there's one other thing I want to talk to you about, because in this lesson, there's a video that you're going to be watching tomorrow where it talks about one other thing. It talks about color bias. And in watercolor, color bias is you need to know what bias your color has for color mixing. And so, for example, this yellow, it doesn't really, it's a little bit of a cooler yellow. If it had a little bit more red in it, its bias would be towards the warm colors, or its bias would be towards red. It would be a reddish yellow. If this had a little bit more blue in it, kind of a green, like just erring on that side, like it's a little bit, it would have a bias of green. You need to be careful when you're mixing colors that you mix colors of the same bias together, or you'll end up with muddy colors. It's kind of like you would be mixing all of the primaries together, because this would have yellow and blue if you were mixing it with red. If you mix red, yellow, and blue together, you'll find out you make brown, like a brown muddy color. So they talk about it in this, but it doesn't really apply to us because we have a really limited palette that has been designed by Crayola that these colors will mix together and be okay. So we're pretty true. We don't really have a bias one way or another. So tomorrow when you hear them talk about color bias, don't worry about it, okay? That's something you'll learn more in high school, or if we start squirting some colors out, we might think about it a little bit, but I don't think you need to worry about it too much. Okay, so we've done this right here. Now the last thing we want to do really quick is we want to talk about wet on wet and wet on dry, because we're about to play a game. And with our game, I want you guys to play it with either wet on wet or wet on dry. And what wet on wet is, it's when you paint into a wet surface. So in fact, I'll do this like we're playing the game. We're going to set this aside. Okay. In the middle of your tables, I think that hopefully we've got a bunch of these in the boxes in the center of your table, some of these little scraps. You need to get 3 of these out. Okay. And each of you will have 3. And you're going to create your own color on 1/2, just one square on 1/2. Leave the other half empty, and you're going to create a color. And once you've made your colors, you need to put these at the back table and let somebody else choose one of yours and see if they can figure out how you made your color. So this is kind of a fun game to try to do a little bit of color matching. It's pretty fun. So let's say I'm going to start with a little wet on wet. I'm going to go ahead and get a little square wet. This is where I paint with wet paint onto wet paper, and it has a really different look than wet on dry. I'll show you wet on dry in a minute. So first you're going to need to determine, sure, you're going to see a color, but you need to decide if they painted their layers wet on wet or wet on dry. I'm going to go ahead and get quite a bit of yellow in here. You know, yellow's kind of weak. And when I paint it into here, it's going to make it very soft and smooth. So I'm going to paint my next color while this is wet. All right. While this is wet, I'm going to go ahead and put in a secret color of orange. Make a yellow orange. We'll see if anyone can figure that out. Now let's keep this color mixing kind of simple. Let's keep it 2 or 3 colors that you use to make your new color. Okay, 2 or 3. Now if I go ahead and I put orange in here while this is wet, it's going to bleed and travel and be super smooth looking. Okay, really smooth. And maybe I want a little more yellow in there. Maybe just a little bit. But we can see it's going to bleed and flow and look very watery. Okay, that would be one done. Okay, I could set this one aside. Now, if I wanted to do wet on dry, this time I'm going to do something kind of crazy. We're going to do 2 colors that are opposite on the color wheel. I'm going to do purple with yellow. We're going to see what happens. I should get brown if theory is right. Okay. We're going to do a lot of yellow again. Can you tell that yellow is one that's going to wear out a lot because we have to use a lot of yellow pigment. We always those colors that are weak, you always have to use a lot of. I'm going to use yellow again. Okay, I'm going to save this. We're going to come back and add purple in a minute. I'm going to let this dry for a little bit. And so we're painting wet onto dry. We're going to see what that looks like. In the meantime, we're going to do one more. And we're going to do something called a shade. A shade of something is when you add black to a color. A tint is when you add white. But guess what? There's no white in here. So how is it that we make a tint of a color? Well, you already did. Back here on your page, when you were using the white of the paper because this is translucent, to mix with your color, anytime you go lighter with less water, you're making tints of that color. So you already know how to make a tint. But a shade is a little bit different. Now black is very, very strong. We don't want a ton of black in here. So I am going to go ahead and put my wheat color in first. We're going to do a shade of green. And I'm going to do this wet on wet. So I'm going to go ahead and do a patch of green. Now I need very, very little black. And make sure it's clean. I always see how much I use my paper towel, a lot. And there's paper towels up front. They're really good for watercolor. They're not the ones that come out of the machine. They are white little folded ones. They're already folded so they absorb really well. They are my favorite. So there's a stack of those. Just grab one off of there. One other one below will try to come out. But just grab one and keep that one. Like, store it with your stuff until it's completely worn out. You will use it for a really long time. A paper towel is a very, very important tool to have with you when you're watercoloring. So I'm just going to grab a tiniest bit of black. I'm going to test it just a little bit over here. That's maybe too much. Just a little water, take a little bit out. And I'm going to add a little layer. Oh, maybe not enough now. I'm going to add just a little bit of black to this. That was kind of a lot. I might get a thirsty brush and kind of take a tiny bit of that out. Yeah, that's interesting, right? Okay, and that changed that a lot. Now, these were wet on wet. They look super smooth and really blended. I'm going to do one that's wet on dry. I've let this one dry. There's one little spot that's still a tiny bit wet, but most of it's pretty dry now. And you can always take your art to the blow dryer and dry it really quick, because sometimes you want it to be dry because you want crisp edges. None of my color has any crisp edges here. So let's go ahead and let's play. And let's see what happens if I were to add, say, we were going to add purple, right? Okay, I'm making sure my brush is really clean. Okay. We're not going to add too much purple. I like to test a little bit on a piece of paper. We're going to see theoretically when you add opposites on the color wheel, or the complementary color. Remember, complement of yellow is purple, complement of blue is orange, complement of red is green, and vice versa. It will neutralize and should theoretically, muddy color should happen. And sometimes you want that for shadows. Nope, not enough purple in there. Now this time, is it going in smooth, or do I see streaks and stripes? I will see really crisp edges. Nothing is bleeding or going in very smooth. It's going to be kind of crunchy and have sharp edges, unlike it did here. Sometimes that's what you want. So this could be a technique. I want you not only to, when you make your copy of someone else's color, I want you to decide, did they do wet on wet, or did they let it dry and do wet on dry? So one other thing you can see, these were wet on dry. See how crisp the edges are. If I had tried to paint one of these stripes when my paper was wet, I'm going to do a red stripe now. I'll go back to my round brush. Round brushes are going to make tiny tips. You're only going to be able to do flat bits with the flat brush. But if I were to try to make a really fine line, oh, I cannot in wet, but isn't that a gorgeous kind of line? Like that could have a really cool effect, but it's going to bleed and flow and move around. You can't get crisp edges like you could all by itself where it's not wet right up here. So a really different feel will happen. And as this dries, it's even going to spread more. It's going to get really spread out. So wet on wet, wet on dry, and we're going to play with some color mixing. You've got a color wheel to refer to think about those complementary colors and how to neutralize a color or create the shadow version for that color. You also know about shades, and you know you can make tints too. So there's a whole bunch of things that you can try out. So now you guys are ready. Let's start the game. Okay, do 3 colors, take them to the back table, set them there, choose somebody else's 3, take them over to your spot, and you can go ahead and see if you can match their color. One last thing before we're done. Make sure you dry your brushes off the best you can before you store them. Also, if there's puddles of water in your paint trays, you either need to pull those out or put your tray in your cubby open so that this can dry overnight. It's a really good idea. You never want to leave water puddles in there and shut this. Also, you can see what's happened in the lid of my tray. We've used this as a mixing place where you can actually mix colors together and sometimes use those. So I've got this kind of foresty green color that was already mixed. Maybe I was making some Christmas trees or something. And if you get done today, you can get in your sketchbook and just try different brush strokes. See how small of lines you can make, how big of lines you can make, and just experiment a little bit today before you learn about tomorrow's project. You'll be so happy you did. It's just a lot of fun. So your lid is always a place where you can do some really cool color mixing as well. You can wipe your lid out anytime you need to. In fact, there's one other thing you can do. These lids do just come off, and you can take these to the sink and rinse them out, and then they just pop back on. They're made to come off and on so that you can use them that way. So you guys are going to have a ton of fun. I know you're going to do awesome. I can't wait to see your art. All right. Thanks, you guys.